Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with a review for Southern Nightmare: The Hunt for the Southside Strangler by Richard Foster. This is a true crime book about a serial killer who was active in Richmond, Virginia in the 1980s. His first murder occurred in 1983, there were rapes prior to that, and most of the murders took place in 1987. This is a very interesting book to me because I live in Richmond, Virginia. This is an indie book. It's published by a local guy from around Richmond, and my sister gave this to me for Christmas. This is not really the kind of book I'd normally pick up for myself, but I thought it was really interesting. I wound up giving it 4 stars. This is a very fact-based true crime. A lot of true crime books tell the story from the perspective of one person, or they focus on one element, one detective, one victim, something along those lines. They make it more of a narrative. This did not really do that so much. This was more of a play-by-play of the investigation itself. It starts from the beginning and goes through pretty much every detail Richard Foster could find. And in that sense, it was incredibly well researched. But I do tend to prefer more dramatized true crime books. Still nonfiction, obviously, but with that sort of human element that I felt was kind of lacking in this. But not that that's necessarily a bad thing. This was just doing something different than I tend to prefer. So I do want to say, for that reason, this is not the kind of book I'd get for myself. This was a gift, and I did wind up really enjoying it. I don't know that this would have been a 4-star read for me if it hadn't been about my hometown. Just the fact that it was set in Richmond, and that it kept referencing things that I knew and understood added a lot. Like, for example, one of the victims, he went through her schooling history. He was like, she went to Tucker High School, and then she went to UVA, and then U of R, and then MCV. And he does, like, give a brief definition of those places. Like, obviously, Tucker High School is a high school, and really all you need to know is that it is a high school. But since I actually know Tucker, and I've been inside Tucker, and that we were rivals with them, with my high school, it added more depth and more understanding, and it gave this story, like, a kind of deeper layer to me that you don't really need to know to read this book and understand it and have it be a good book. But for me, it really did contribute so much to my enjoyment. This was, above all else, really well researched. He says in the introduction that he's interviewed 50 people for this book, and it definitely shows. He talks at points about how witnesses say things that are discrepancies with what the cops say, and then he says multiple witnesses will independently corroborate something that the cops disagree with, and he's like, well, I can't, prove it one way or the other, but considering I have these 2 witnesses who don't talk to each other, who both say this one thing happened, kind of seems like the cops might be lying, which was really interesting and just so well researched and well done. The last few chapters of the book, or the last few sections, after really the book is complete, he does include several interviews that were in his podcast, because he has a podcast that was very popular about these murders. And he includes interviews with some of the people who he talked to, and that was really interesting to read. I'm not sure how much I particularly enjoyed that, but it was an interesting element that I really appreciated being there. And it was something I don't see in really any other true crime books that I've read. The focus of this book is the fact that this was one of the first cases in, honestly, the history of the world that used DNA evidence for a murder. I don't think it was the absolute first. It was the first in something, I don't remember what, but it was one of the first to ever use DNA to find a killer. He left his semen on several of the women, and they were able to match that to his blood. And that was a very interesting element. It focused a lot on that, particularly in the later chapters, and I think up until that point I was really loving this book, and then that just sort of lost me. I'm not a science person, but if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, he talks not really about the science of it, but just like the history of how it was used as a forensic tool, and that was really unique. That's not something I've seen a lot in true crime books, so if that interests you, I'd highly recommend this book. I'd also recommend checking out the podcast if you're interested, if you like podcasts of these kind of things. It's a very popular podcast. He said it was like on several top 10 lists on like iTunes, which is interesting. If you're into that kind of thing, if this book sounds interesting, the podcast might be of interest to you as well. I think the podcast does go more in depth probably on the forensic side of it. He said one person called it a love letter to forensic DNA or something along those lines, which I can definitely see. And if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend this. I think overall it was a really well done book. It was really interesting, and it was interesting to read some true crime that I wouldn't have ordinarily picked up for myself. If you like true crime that's really just an in-depth discussion of the crime itself, I think this would be a worthwhile read, because this was really very detailed. It covers all the victims, it covers all the police investigators and everything they did, and it doesn't really add anything to that. It's just sort of the case as it was, with the added layer of the history of DNA. This probably would have been a 3-star read if I hadn't enjoyed so much the Richmond element of the book and having that personal connection to it. But I think it was well done for what it is. Just what it is wasn't what I usually would pick up. Honestly, I'd never heard of this case before. I think I'd heard his name before. He was put to death in Virginia in the 90s, and I do feel fairly certain that I'd heard his name before, because it did sound familiar. But I'd never heard of the case. I didn't know there was a serial killer in Richmond. And it was interesting because my parents literally moved here a month after he was apprehended. Like, he hadn't even gone to trial yet. He was apprehended in, I think, late January of 1988, and my father moved here Valentine's Day weekend, so just a few weeks later. We honestly live where we do in Richmond because it was not one of the areas he was targeting. Just the personal connection really made this book interesting and worthwhile for me. But I do think if this is the kind of thing you're into, it's very well done, it's very well researched, and it's just like a really great indie book that, for true crime lovers who like the more procedural aspects, I would highly recommend. Let me know if this sounds interesting to you, or if you're considering checking out the podcast, because I think that's something I might do now after having read this book, because I don't listen to many podcasts, but already having this book as background, I'm kind of intrigued by it. And I'd like to learn more about my city's history when it comes to serial killer murders. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.